Her brothers took everything after their grandfather died. The house, the savings, the stocks he'd spent a lifetime building. But in their greed, they forgot the one thing he'd ever called his own. A derelict auto shop on a forgotten highway. What she discovered there wasn't just about inheritance. It was about the truth that can set you free. If you've ever felt counted out, stick around. This story is for you, and if it resonates, maybe hit that subscribe button. We're building a community here for people who know what it means to start over. The day I turned 18 was the day I became officially homeless. They called it aging out. It sounds like a gentle, natural process, like a tree losing its leaves in autumn. The reality was a cardboard box, a final check for $257, and the signature of a caseworker who couldn't quite meet my eyes. For 2 years since Grandpa Joe passed, the state had been my guardian. 2 years of beige walls, scheduled meals, and the constant low hum of institutional life. The box wasn't heavy. It contained a few worn paperbacks, a cracked photo of my grandfather and me covered in grease and smiling, and a stack of clothes that smelled faintly of industrial laundry soap. I stood on the curb, the gray March sky spitting a cold, indecisive drizzle. The group home door clicked shut behind me, a sound of finality that was both terrifying and liberating. For a moment, I just stood there, watching my breath cloud in the air, a ghost in a world that wasn't expecting me. My brothers, Mark and Leo, hadn't called. I didn't expect them to. After Grandpa Joe's funeral, they had been efficient. They were both in their late 20s, with sharp suits and sharper smiles that never reached their eyes. They had explained to my then 16-year-old self that Grandpa's estate was complicated, that there were debts. They said they would handle it, put things in a trust for me, make sure I was taken care of. I learned later, through a sympathetic social worker who did some digging, that taken care of meant selling the family home for a shocking profit, liquidating every asset and splitting it between themselves. The trust was a fiction. When I was placed in state care, they had signed the papers without a second thought. They were free of their kid sister and suddenly very rich. I started walking, the box digging into my hip. I had no destination. The bus station, maybe. Buy a ticket to somewhere warmer. Somewhere that didn't feel like the end of the world. My phone, a cheap burner I'd bought with saved chore money, buzzed in my pocket. An unknown number. I almost ignored it, assuming it was a wrong number or a scam, one more piece of cosmic static. But something made me answer. "Hello," I said, my voice small against the traffic noise. "Am I speaking with Maya Vance?" The voice was male, older, with a dry, careful cadence. Sounded like old paper smells. "Who's asking?" I clutched the box tighter. "My name is Arthur Evans. I was your grandfather's attorney. And friend," he added after a slight pause. "I've been trying to reach you for some time." The state services were not forthcoming with contact details. I stopped walking. A car splashed through a puddle nearby, soaking the cuff of my jeans. I barely noticed. "My grandfather?" "Yes, Joseph Vance. He left something for you, Maya. It was stipulated in his will that I was not to contact you about it until your 18th birthday. He was very specific about the date." My heart started a frantic, uneven rhythm against my ribs. Something left for me? Felt impossible. Mark and Leo had been so thorough. "What did he leave?" I asked, the words catching in my throat. "It's complicated," Mr. Evans said, and I could hear the rustle of papers on his end. "The primary assets of the estate, as you may know, were passed to your brothers. But there is a secondary property, a commercial lot with a garage. It seems your brothers were either unaware of its separate deed or deemed it worthless. It's located in a town called Havenwood." I had a vague memory of the name. "A place Grandpa Joe used to talk about, where he got his start." "A garage." "An auto repair shop, to be precise," Mr. Evans clarified. He called it Second Chance Auto. "The deed is solely in your name, effective today. However, there is the matter of several years of unpaid property taxes. A significant amount, I'm afraid. If they aren't addressed soon, the county will seize the property and auction it off." He named a number that made the $257 in my pocket feel like pocket lint. It was an impossible sum, a cruel joke, a gift I couldn't afford to accept. "Why?" I whispered to him to the gray sky. Why would he do that? I believe he hoped it would be just that, Mr. Evans said, his voice softening for the first time. A second chance. He left a package for you here at my office, along with the keys. He said you'd know what to do. I stood on that wet sidewalk, holding a box of everything I owned in the world, and felt the first flicker of something that wasn't despair. It wasn't quite hope. It was more like curiosity, a reason to take the next step. Where is your office? I asked. Mr. Evans's office was in a part of the city I'd never seen, a quiet street lined with old brick buildings that spoke of a time when business was done with a handshake and a man's word. The air inside smelled of leather, wood polish, and aging paper. It was the smell of permanence, of history, a stark contrast to the sterile, transient world I had just left. Mr. Evans was exactly as his voice suggested. A tall, thin man in a rumpled tweed jacket, with kind, tired eyes behind thick spectacles. He didn't offer pity, for which I was grateful. He offered me a seat and a cup of tea that warmed my cold hands. He slid a thick manila envelope across his polished desk. The deed, the tax notices, the keys, he said, tapping a finger on the bundle. It's all in there. The property is yours, free and clear, provided you can satisfy the debt to the county. He paused, studying my face. Your grandfather was a good man, Maya. One of the best. He worried about you a great deal, especially after your parents. Well, he worried. I nodded, unable to speak. I remembered his hands, calloused and permanently stained with grease, but always so gentle. He could fix anything. A sputtering engine, a broken toy, a scraped knee. He just couldn't fix my family. He was also a stubborn man, Mr. Evans continued with a faint smile. He knew your brothers. He saw their natures long before they came into their inheritance. He set this up years ago, this little island for you. He told me, a person needs a place to stand, Arthur. Just one solid piece of ground. Then they can move the world, this shop. This was meant to be your piece of ground. I stared at the envelope. It felt impossibly heavy. The taxes, I said, the word tasting like ash. There's no way. He didn't leave you with nothing, Mr. Evans said, and he pulled a smaller, letter-sized envelope from a drawer. It was sealed with wax, the way Grandpa Joe used to seal birthday cards. My name was written on the front in his familiar, blocky scrawl. This is the package he left. He said it would explain things better than any lawyer could. I took the letter, my fingers tracing his handwriting. It felt like a direct connection to him, a voice from a place I couldn't reach. The finality of his death, which had been a dull ache for 2 years, suddenly became sharp, acute. Your brothers, Mr. Evans said carefully, are under the impression that the entire estate has been settled. They signed off on the final accounting months ago. As this property was deeded to you in a separate trust that activated on your 18th birthday, they were never legally notified of its existence. It was an elegant bit of legal maneuvering on your grandfather's part. He wanted to ensure they couldn't touch it. For all their cleverness, their sharp suits and quick signatures, they had missed it. They had stripped the house bare, sold his beloved old truck, cashed in the retirement funds, but they had missed the heart of it all. They had missed the one thing he truly valued, his work. Thank you, I said, my voice hoarse. I stood up, clutching the 2 envelopes. What are you going to do? He asked, not as a lawyer, but as a man who seemed genuinely concerned. I'm going to Havenwood, I said, the decision solidifying even as I spoke it. I'm going to see my piece of ground. The bus ride to Havenwood was a journey backward in time. The gleaming skyscrapers of the city gave way to sprawling suburbs, then to patchwork farmland, and finally to dense, dark woods that crowded the edges of the highway. The bus was mostly empty, populated by a few sleeping travelers and the ghosts of my own memories. I leaned my head against the cool glass of the window, watching the world blur by. Grandpa Joe had been a mechanic his whole life. It wasn't just a job to him, it was a philosophy. Everything can be fixed, Maya girl, he'd tell me, his head under the hood of a car. You just gotta be patient. You gotta listen to what it's telling you. People are like engines. Sometimes they just need a little timing adjustment, a clean filter, some fresh oil. His own kids, my dad and my uncle, had never understood. They wanted clean hands and quick money. They had drifted away from him long before the car accident that took my parents and left me in his care. My brothers, Mark and Leo, were their father's sons. They saw Grandpa Joe's life as a failure, a greasy, small-time existence. They didn't see the pride in his eyes when an old engine roared back to life. They didn't see the gratitude in the faces of the people he helped, folks who couldn't afford a dealership repair bill. They only saw the dirt under his fingernails. I opened the large envelope from Mr. Evans. The deed was there, an official-looking document with my name printed in stark, black ink. Underneath it were the tax notices. Red stamps, angry warnings, escalating figures. The total was even worse than I remembered. It was a mountain. The keys were at the bottom, two heavy, old-fashioned brass keys on a simple metal ring. They felt real, solid. I closed my hand around them, the metal cool and unyielding against my palm. The bus pulled into Havenwood just as the sun was setting, painting the bruised purple sky with streaks of orange and pink. The town wasn't much more than a wide spot in the road. A single main street with a blinking traffic light, a diner with a buzzing neon sign, a few shuttered storefronts, and a gas station. It was the kind of place people pass through, not a place they stop. The bus hissed to a halt in front of what passed for a station, a simple wooden bench under a small awning. I was the only one who got off. The bus pulled away with a groan, leaving me in a sudden, profound silence broken only by the chirping of crickets. I checked the address on the deed. It was on the old highway, about a mile out of the town center. The air was different here, thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. It smelled like my grandfather's flannel shirts. I adjusted the box on my hip, slung my thin backpack over my shoulder, and started walking. The walk was longer than I expected. The pavement gave way to a cracked and weed-choked road. Streetlights vanished. The last light of the sunset faded, and the woods on either side of the road became a wall of impenetrable shadow. I was starting to feel a deep, creeping fear. Maybe this was a mistake. A ghost chase. What was I going to find at the end of this road? A pile of rubble? A condemned building? A final, crushing disappointment? And then I saw it. Set back from the road, half swallowed by overgrown vines and shadowed by two massive oak trees, was a long, low building. Its paint was peeling, its large bay doors were boarded up, and a sign, hanging crookedly from one chain, swung in the gentle breeze. The faded letters were just barely legible in the gloom. Second Chance Auto. I had arrived. It was my piece of ground, and it looked like it was sinking. For a long time, I just stood at the edge of the gravel driveway, looking at the place. It was bigger than I had imagined, but also far more dilapidated. The windows were opaque with grime. Weeds grew tall enough to hide a small car. A sense of profound abandonment hung over it, a silence that felt deeper than just the absence of noise. It was the silence of forgotten things. My initial spark of curiosity was quickly being extinguished by a cold wave of reality. This wasn't a gift. It was a burden, a ruin, another dead end. I almost turned around. I could walk back to the bus stop, wait for the morning bus, and just leave, disappear. Forget the name Vance and everything that came with it. But then my fingers brushed against the keys in my pocket. Grandpa Joe's keys. He had sent me here for a reason. He trusted I would know what to do. The least I could do was open the door. The front door was set to the side of the main garage bays. Its lock was stiff with rust and disuse. I had to put my shoulder into it, but after a moment of resistance, the first key turned with a loud, grating clunk. The sound echoed in the quiet night. I pushed the door open, and it groaned on its hinges like a waking beast. The air that rolled out was thick and heavy, a potent combination of stale gasoline, cold metal, and dust. It was the smell of my childhood. I stepped inside, using my phone's flashlight to cut through the darkness. The beam slid across a small, cluttered office. A thick layer of dust covered everything like a funeral shroud. A desk, a cracked vinyl chair, a filing cabinet, and a wall calendar. Its pages still turned to August, 2 years ago. the month he died. I ran my hand over the dusty desk, leaving a clean streak. Underneath, my fingers found a familiar groove, a small, almost invisible notch he'd carved into the wood. I remembered sitting on his lap in this very office, a little girl watching him work on his ledgers. He'd let me play with his pens, and one day I'd made a small mark on his desk. Instead of getting mad, he'd smiled, taken out his pocket knife, and turned my little scratch into a tiny, 5-pointed star. It was still there. A knot formed in my throat. He was here. His ghost, his memory, it was in the very dust of this place. The second key on the ring was smaller. I knew it was for the filing cabinet. The lock was just as stubborn as the one on the door. When it finally gave way, the drawer slid open with a screech of metal on metal. It was filled with old work orders, receipts, manuals for cars that probably weren't on the road anymore. In the very back, tucked away behind a stack of invoices, was a small metal cash box. It wasn't locked. I lifted the lid, my heart pounding. Inside, there was no cash. There was no secret treasure. There was just a single, folded piece of paper. It was a photograph, the same one I carried in my box. Me and him grinning, our faces smudged with grease. On the back, in his handwriting, were 3 words. Check the floorboards. My flashlight beam danced around the small office. The floor was covered in faded, cracked linoleum. But under the desk, where his chair would have been, a small section of the flooring was curled up at the corner, as if it had been lifted many times. I knelt down, my knees cracking in the cold, and pulled. The linoleum came away easily, revealing the dark wood of the subfloor beneath. There I saw it, a single plank that wasn't quite flush with the others. It had no nails. I wedged my fingers into the seam and lifted. It came up with a soft groan of old wood. And there, nestled in the dark, dusty space below, was a large, flat, wooden box. It wasn't a cash box or a toolbox. It looked more like a chest for storing old documents or photographs. My name, Maya, was burned into the lid. My hands trembled as I lifted it out. It was heavy, solid, real. This was it. This was the package Mr. Evans had been talking about. I sat on the dusty floor of my grandfather's forgotten office, the single beam of my phone's flashlight cutting a circle of light around me, and I placed the box in my lap. For a moment, I just stared at my name, branded into the dark wood. Felt like a claim, like an anchor. I took a deep breath, the scent of oil and time filling my lungs, and I lifted the lid. The box was filled with letters, dozens of them, tied in bundles with twine, each addressed to me in his familiar script. They were organized by year. I picked up the first bundle, the one on top. The postmark on the top envelope was dated just a week after my parents' funeral. I was 10 years old. My hands shook as I untied the twine and slid the letter from its envelope. The paper was thick and soft with age. I began to read. "My dearest Maya girl," it started. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are a young woman now. I'm sorry I'm not there to see it. I'm sorry for a lot of things. I hope you can forgive an old man for doing the best he could with a bad hand. Your parents, they were good people, but they were dreamers. They never had their feet on the ground. When they died, I knew I had to be your rock. I knew I had to be the ground for you. I had to stop, my vision blurring." I wiped my eyes with the back of my dusty hand and continued reading. "I'm writing this first letter from the office of my old shop. I haven't been here in years. After your grandmother passed, it was too quiet. Too many ghosts. But today it feels right. I'm leaving this place to you, Maya. Not the house, not the money. Your brothers will take that. I know it already. They're like their father. They see the world in dollars and cents. They don't see the value in a day's hard work, in a thing built with your own 2 hands. But you do. I've seen it in you since you were a little girl, following me around this garage like my shadow, your hands just as greasy as mine." The next letter was from a year later. He wrote about my first day of middle school, how proud he was of my report card. He wrote about teaching me how to change the oil in his old truck, how I wasn't afraid to get my hands dirty. Each letter was a snapshot of our life together, a memory I had lived but never seen from his perspective. He saw everything. He saw my loneliness, my quiet struggle to make friends. He saw my strength, the fierce loyalty I had for the few people I cared about. Then I got to the letters written after he got sick. His handwriting was a little shakier, the lines not quite as straight, but the words were clearer than ever. The doctors say I don't have much time. I'm scared, Maya girl. Not of dying. I'm scared of leaving you alone. Mark and Leo came to visit today. They didn't ask how I was feeling. They asked about the will. They wanted to know what they were getting. I looked at their faces, and I saw nothing of me, nothing of your grandmother. I saw hungry ghosts. That's when I knew I had to protect you. Not with money. Money can be stolen, it can be wasted. I had to leave you something that they would never understand, something they would overlook. I had to leave you a place to stand. I picked up the last letter. It was a single page written on his personal stationery. The date was 2 days before he died. Maya, this shop is more than just a building. It's a legacy of sweat and honesty. But it's also in trouble. I had to mortgage it years ago to pay for your grandmother's medical bills. I've been paying it down, but there's still a debt on it, and the property taxes are piling up. I've left you a puzzle, not a prize. I'm sorry for that, but it was the only way. Your brothers would have sold it for scrap if it was easy. But they're lazy. A problem with this many thorns on it? They wouldn't bother. They'd let it rot. But you're a fighter. You'll figure it out, he went on to explain. He had a plan. A crazy, long-shot plan. There is money, he wrote. Not in a bank. Never trust a bank with the important things. Remember the old rules, Maya. The shop rules. Rule number 1. Always check the pressure. Rule number 2. Never force a bolt. And rule number 3. The most valuable parts are always hidden in plain sight. I love you more than words can say. Be strong. Be smart. Don't let them win. Your Grandpa Joe. I sat there in the cold and the dark. The letters spread around me like fallen leaves. I cried. I cried for the grandfather I had lost. For the little girl who had lost her parents. For the teenager who had been abandoned by her brothers. I cried for the sheer, overwhelming love I could feel pouring out of those pages. A love so fierce it had reached across time and death to find me. And then my phone rang again, vibrating against the wooden floor with a jarring buzz. I looked at the screen. It was an unknown number, but it wasn't the same one as Mr. Evans. A cold dread washed over me. I answered, my voice a raw whisper. Hello, Maya? Is that you? The voice was slick, familiar, and filled with a false warmth that made my skin crawl. It was my brother, Leo. How did you get this number? I asked, my voice flat. Doesn't matter. Listen, a little birdie told me you were contacted by Grandpa's old lawyer. Something about a piece of property. Of course, Mr. Evans must have had to file some public notice of the trust activation. They had found out. It's nothing, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. It's a ruin. Yeah, that's what we figured, Leo said with a dismissive laugh. Mark looked it up. It's in the middle of nowhere, owes a fortune in back taxes. Basically worthless. But look, we're not monsters. We feel bad about how things went down. We're willing to help you out. I waited, saying nothing. There's a developer who's been buying up land out there for a new highway interchange, he continued, his voice shifting into its salesman tone. They'll pay pennies on the dollar for distressed properties. We can handle the negotiation, pay the taxes out of the sale, and we'll send you a check for, say, $5,000. For your trouble. You just have to sign the deed over to us, $5,000. It was more money than I had ever seen in my life. It was a bus ticket to anywhere. It was a security deposit on an apartment. It was a way out. All I had to do was sign a piece of paper and walk away from this dusty, debt-ridden ruin. I looked around the dark office, at the letters from my grandfather. I thought of his words, place to stand. Don't let them win. No, I said. The word was quiet, but it felt like the heaviest thing I had ever lifted. There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. What did you say? Leo asked, his voice losing its friendly veneer. I said no, I repeated louder this time. It's mine. Don't be an idiot, Maya, he snapped. You can't do anything with that place. It's a liability. You're an 18-year-old kid with nothing. Take the money. It's the smart play. It's not about the money, I said, and for the first time, I believed it. Goodbye, Leo. I hung up before he could respond. I switched off my phone, plunging the room into absolute darkness. I sat there, my heart hammering against my ribs, a wild mix of terror and exhilaration coursing through me. I had just declared war. A war I had no idea how to win. The weight of it all came crashing down. The taxes, the repairs, my brothers, who would now surely see the shop not as worthless, but as something I wanted, and therefore something they had to take from me. I curled up on the floor, my head on my knees, and felt a despair so profound it was almost peaceful. It was too much. Grandpa Joe had overestimated me. I wasn't a fighter. I was just a scared kid in a dusty room. And if you've ever been in a situation that felt utterly hopeless, where every door seems locked and the walls are closing in, I want you to drop a comment below. Just a word or two, because you're not alone. I read all the comments, and I know how powerful it is to see that someone else has walked through that same fire. This community is for all of us who have had to find a strength we didn't know we possessed. Your story matters. And if you want to see how this one ends, make sure you're subscribed. Because the night was far from over. I must have fallen asleep on the floor, because I woke to the faint gray light of dawn filtering through the grimy office windows. My body ached, and a deep chill had settled into my bones. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. Then the smell of old oil hit me, and it all came rushing back. The shop, the letters, the phone call with Leo. The despair of the night before was still there. A cold knot in my stomach, but the light of a new day changed its texture. It was no longer an absolute darkness, but a landscape of shadows and obstacles I could at least see. I sat up, pushing the scattered letters aside, and my eyes fell on Grandpa Joe's last message. The most valuable parts are always hidden in plain sight. What did that mean? I had searched the office. The cash box was empty. The filing cabinets held nothing but old papers. What had I missed? I stood up and stretched, my joints protesting. I needed to see the whole place in the daylight. I walked out of the office and into the main garage. It was a cavernous space with 2 hydraulic lifts set into the concrete floor like sleeping iron giants. The morning light struggled through the filthy skylights, illuminating swirling dust motes in the air. Tools hung from pegboards on the walls, outlined in black paint, though many were missing, leaving ghostly silhouettes behind. Workbenches were littered with the fossilized remains of old projects. A disconnected carburetor, a tangle of wires, a coffee can full of bolts. It was a mess, but it was a good mess. An honest mess. My gaze swept the room, looking for anything out of place. Everything was covered in the same thick, uniform layer of dust. Nothing seemed to have been disturbed for 2 years. Then I saw them. In the back corner of the garage, there were 2 large, vaguely car-shaped objects covered in heavy canvas tarps. They were so coated with dust and debris that they blended into the background, looking more like piles of forgotten junk than anything else. Hidden in plain sight, my heart started to beat a little faster. I walked over, my footsteps silent on the dusty concrete. I reached out and touched one of the tarps. The canvas was stiff and rough. I found a corner and pulled. The tarp was heavy, and it came away with a shower of dust and dried leaves that had blown in through some crack in the wall. What was underneath took my breath away. It was a car, but not just any car. It was a classic, a 1967 Ford Mustang, its iconic lines unmistakable even under a layer of grime. Its paint was a deep cherry red, and from what I could see, the body was in perfect condition. No rust, no dents. It was a restoration project, but one that was nearly complete. My grandfather had loved Mustangs. He used to tell me stories about them, how they represented a kind of American freedom and spirit. I moved to the second tarp, my hands trembling with anticipation. I pulled it back, and this time I let out an audible gasp. It was another classic, a Chevrolet Corvette Stingray from the early 70s. Its fiberglass body the color of a midnight sky. Like the Mustang, It was pristine, a sleeping beauty waiting for a touch. These weren't just cars. These were treasures. Even in their dusty, dormant state, they were worth a fortune. More than enough to pay the back taxes and then some. But where were the keys? The titles? A car without papers is just a very large, very heavy lawn ornament. I remembered the third rule again. The most valuable parts are hidden in plain sight. It wasn't just the cars. There had to be something else. I scanned the garage again, my eyes wide with new purpose. What did I see every day? What was so common, so mundane, that it would be overlooked? My eyes landed on a heavy metal workbench against the far wall. It was a standard issue shop bench, scarred and stained from decades of work. On its top was an old bench vise, a heavy, iron clamp used for holding parts. It was bolted directly to the surface of the bench. It was a permanent fixture. No one would ever think to move it. But I remembered Grandpa Joe installing it. He'd had me help him, told me to hold the bolts from underneath while he tightened them from the top. The bolts went all the way through the thick wooden top of the bench. And the bench itself wasn't just a bench. It had a hollow cavity underneath, a false bottom he had built himself. Never force a bolt. He wasn't just talking about cars. He was talking about this. I ran over to the bench. The vise was massive. I tried to turn the crank, but it was rusted shut. I found a can of penetrating oil on a shelf, the same brand he always used. I sprayed the mechanism liberally, the acrid smell filling the air. I waited a few minutes, then tried again. With a groan of protest, the crank began to turn. It wasn't the vise I was opening. The crank wasn't attached to the clamp. It was attached to a long screw that went down through the bench. As I turned it, the entire top of the vise began to lift, and with it, a square section of the wooden tabletop it was bolted to. It was a hidden compartment, operated by the vise handle itself. It was brilliant. It was so perfectly him. Inside the compartment, wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from moisture, were 2 sets of car keys, 2 thick packets of documents, and a stack of cash bound with a rubber band. I pulled out the packets first. They were the original titles for the Mustang and the Corvette, both signed over to him clean and clear. Tucked inside with them was the original deed to the property, the one that predated the mortgage. And attached to it was a legal document, stamped by a notary. It was a notice of a paid lien. He had paid off the mortgage. He must have done it right at the end with the last of his savings. The bank that held the mortgage had since been bought out, its records likely lost in the merger. The county only had a record of the original lien, not its satisfaction. This paper was the proof. The debt on the property wasn't real. The only thing I owed was the back taxes. I picked up the stack of cash. I counted it quickly. It was $10,000. Exactly what he had estimated the back taxes would be, with a little left over. He had left me everything I needed. The proof, the means, and the way forward. He hadn't left me a burden. He hadn't left me a puzzle. He had left me a test of faith. He needed to know that I would come here, that I would believe in him, that I would look for the answers instead of taking the easy way out. The phone call from Leo had been the final part of the test. Would I sell my birthright for a handful of cash? I had passed. I sank to the floor, the titles in one hand, the cash in the other, and I laughed. It was a strange, choked sound, half sob and half pure joy. He had done it. The stubborn old mechanic had outsmarted them all. He had built me an ark, filled it with everything I needed to survive the flood, and left me a map to find it. All I had to do was show up. The first phone call I made was to Mr. Evans. I had to walk back into town to get a signal, and I used the payphone outside the diner. I explained, my voice shaking with excitement, what I had found. The cars, the paid lien, the cash. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Joseph, you magnificent, stubborn old fool," he finally said, his voice thick with emotion. Of course he did. Of course he told me what to do next. I was to bring the lien document to him immediately. He would file it with the county clerk's office. It would invalidate the bank's claim and reduce the official debt on the property to just the taxes owed. Then I was to go to the county tax office and pay what I owed in full with the cash. Get a receipt. Get copies. Don't tell your brothers anything, Maya, he warned. Let them think you're still drowning. When they make their next move, we'll be ready for them. The next few days were a blur of action. I took the first bus back to the city. I met with Mr. Evans, who looked at the paperwork with a smile that was equal parts admiration and exasperation. He played the long game, he said, shaking his head. He always did. While he went to the courthouse, I went to the tax office. Handing over that much cash to a government clerk was one of the most nerve-wracking things I've ever done. But the woman behind the counter stamped my receipt with a satisfying thud. And just like that, the mountain was gone. The property was mine. Truly, completely mine. When I returned to Havenwood, it was with a full backpack of groceries, a new cheap cell phone, and a feeling I hadn't experienced in years. Security. I walked that mile from the bus stop not with dread, but with purpose. This wasn't just a ruin anymore. It was my home. The first order of business was to make the office livable. I spent 2 solid days scrubbing. I washed the windows, and for the first time, sunlight streamed into the room, illuminating its potential. I scrubbed the floors, swept away the cobwebs, and wiped down every surface. I found an old hot plate and a kettle in a cupboard, and soon I was making tea on my grandfather's desk. In the evenings, I would sit in his old chair and read his letters again, not with grief, but with a sense of conversation. He was there with me in his words, guiding me. I started on the main garage next. It was an archaeological dig. I sorted through piles of old parts, organized tools, and swept away what felt like a metric ton of dust and grime. With every square foot I reclaimed, the place felt more and more like mine. One afternoon, while I was wrestling with one of the heavy bay doors, trying to get it unstuck, a rusty tow truck pulled into the driveway. An old man with a kind, weathered face and overalls got out. "You must be Joe's granddaughter," he said, his voice a friendly rumble.
I'm Goose.
"I used to work here years ago. Heard someone was poking around the old place. I introduced myself, a little wary. Heard your brothers were trying to sell it out from under you," he said, getting straight to the point. "Word gets around in a small town," I nodded. "I'm not selling," he grinned, a wide, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Didn't think so. You've got Joe's chin. Stubborn. He was the best mechanic this county ever saw. Taught me everything I know. Place looks like it needs some work." "That's an understatement," I said with a laugh. "Well," he said, hooking his thumbs in his overalls, "an engine doesn't start with one turn of the key. Takes spark, fuel, and air. Looks like you've got the spark. Maybe I can help with the rest." That was the beginning. Gus started stopping by every day. He helped me get the bay doors working. He showed me how to check the hydraulic lifts. He told me stories about my grandfather, filling in the gaps in my memory. He brought over a couple of old cots from his own garage so I wouldn't have to sleep on the floor. Soon, other people started to appear. The owner of the diner would drop off hot meals, saying she made too much. A retired electrician came by and helped me check the building's wiring, replacing frayed cables and making sure it was safe. A local farmer who my grandfather had helped countless times showed up with his tractor and cleared the overgrown driveway and yard. They didn't ask for money. They did it because they had respected Joe Vance. They saw him in me, and they wanted to help his legacy survive. They were my spark, my fuel, and my air. One evening, a sleek, black sedan I didn't recognize pulled into the newly cleared driveway. My brothers, Mark and Leo, got out. They were wearing their city suits, which looked ridiculously out of place against the rustic backdrop of the shop. They looked at the cleared yard, the clean windows, and the open bay door with expressions of pure disbelief. "What the hell is this?" Mark demanded as he strode towards me. "I told you," I said, my voice even. I refused to let them see me tremble. "It's mine." "We gave you a generous offer, Maya," Leo said, trying to regain his composure and slip back into his reasonable guy persona. "We were trying to help you. Your help was $5,000 for a property that holds 2 classic cars worth over $100,000. Not to mention the land itself, which, by the way, is now in the direct path of a very lucrative highway development," I said calmly. I had done my research. I knew exactly what they were after. The color drained from their faces. They had no idea about the cars. They had just seen the land and the opportunity for a quick flip. The cars, Mark stammered. I just smiled and pointed towards the back of the garage, where the Mustang and the Corvette now sat, gleaming under the bare work lights. I had spent a week polishing them. They were magnificent. My brothers were speechless. They stared at the cars, their minds clearly doing the frantic math. "This isn't over," Mark finally snarled, his mask of civility gone completely. "That property should have been part of the main estate. We'll see you in court. Go ahead," I said, and I held up a piece of paper. It was a copy of the deed and a copy of my paid-in-full tax receipt. "Talk to my lawyer. His name is Arthur Evans. I believe you've heard of him." They stood there for a long moment, defeated. The sharp suits and expensive haircuts couldn't hide the ugly greed in their eyes. They had underestimated me. They had underestimated their grandfather. They had lost. Without another word, they got back in their car and drove away, kicking up gravel as they left. I never saw them again. I stood there, watching their taillights disappear down the old highway, and I didn't feel anger or even triumph. I just felt a quiet sense of peace. The ghosts were gone. The fight was over. Now the work could begin. The months that followed were the hardest and best of my life. With Gus's help, I got the shop into working order. We serviced the lifts, replaced the old air compressor, and bought new tools with the last of the cash my grandfather had left. We started with small jobs, oil changes, tire rotations for the locals who had helped me. The word spread. People in Havenwood and the surrounding towns remembered Joe Vance's reputation for honest work, and they were willing to give his granddaughter a chance. I enrolled in an online course for automotive mechanics, studying late into the night in the little office that was now my home. I was living and breathing this work, and I had never felt more alive. I decided not to sell the classic cars. They weren't just assets. They were his last projects. They were a part of him. I kept the Mustang, my personal symbol of freedom. I sold the Corvette to a collector, a man who appreciated its history and promised to take care of it. The money from that sale was more than I could have dreamed of. It wasn't for a new life somewhere else, though. It was for this life. I used it to modernize the shop, to buy the best equipment, to build a small apartment for myself in the back so I wouldn't have to sleep on a cot anymore. I paid Gus a real salary. I invested back into the place that had saved me. Second Chance Auto was officially reborn. It's funny how a place can become a part of you. This building of concrete and steel, once a symbol of abandonment and debt, was now my sanctuary and my future. It wasn't just a piece of ground my grandfather had left me. It was a foundation. He hadn't just given me a garage. He'd given me a community, a purpose, and a home. He taught me that inheritance isn't about what you're given, but what you do with it. It's not about money. It's about legacy. It's about understanding the sacrifices that came before you and honoring them with your own hard work. He had protected me in the only way he knew how, by giving me a challenge that would force me to find my own strength. The betrayal from my brothers, which had once been a wound that defined me, was now just a scar. It was a part of my story, but it wasn't the whole story. The real story was written in grease and sweat, in the roar of a newly tuned engine, in the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. It was the story of a second chance. And as I stand here today, in the open bay of my own shop, watching the sun set over the trees that line the old highway, I know this is just the beginning. I've learned that the most broken things, whether it's an old car or a young life, can be rebuilt, stronger and better than before. You just have to be patient. You have to listen to what it's telling you. And you can't ever be afraid to get your hands dirty. For everyone watching who has ever been handed a ruin and been told to call it a gift, I want you to know this: you have the tools to fix it. They might be buried, they might be rusty, but they are there. Your strength, your resilience, your spirit, that is your true inheritance. Thank you for letting me share my story with you. If it moved you, if it gave you a little bit of hope, please consider subscribing to the channel. Let me know in the comments about a time you had to build something new from something old. I promise